morning, everyone. Today we have with us Mr. Ahmet Erman Aral. He is from the Ankara Esi Bayram Valley University. He works at the Department of Turkish and Folklore, and he is the chairholder of the UNESCO Chair on ICH, Informal and Informal Education. Thank you so much for being here with us, and I give you the floor.
Thank you. Hello to all. My name is Ahmet Erman Aral. I'm the chairholder of the UNESCO Chair on Intangible Cultural Heritage in Formal and Informal Education. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Pierluigi Petrillo and his colleague Cecilia Honorati for the invitation. Intangible Cultural Heritage and Education is my main field of study, and today I will do my best to inform you on Turkey's experience on intangible heritage and legislation. I will provide a quick overview on Turkey's overall experience in ICH. We don't have a particular legislation for intangible heritage, but first of all, safeguarding the heritage through legislation can be connected to two policy documents. So although implicitly various efforts to safeguard intangible heritage are somehow related to these two pillars in policy. First one is Turkish constitutional law. Article 63 of the Constitution refers to the protection of historical and cultural values. On the other hand, Ministry of Culture and Tourism is the competent body for the implementation of the convention. So its strategic plan covering the last 4 years makes it an important policy document as well. Turkey ratified the convention and became a states party in 2006. And actually, even before the ratification, Turkish National Commission for UNESCO established the ICH Experts Committee. In addition, following the ratification, the General Directorate of Research and Education at the Ministry of Culture and Tourism established a new department in 2007 that is dedicated to intangible heritage, also calling its provincial offices to form intangible heritage boards that are mostly responsible for inventorying and identification of the heritage. With the aim of supporting the safeguarding of intangible heritage through formal education, the Ministry of Education started an elective course titled Folk Culture in secondary schools in 2006, which is right after the ratification of the convention. And it is still in practice today. Next significant development is the creation of UNESCO Chair on Intangible Heritage in Formal and Informal Education in 2017. This is the first and only UNESCO Chair on ICH in the country, and it works in close cooperation with ministries and NGOs. So we expect that the role of our chair will be enhanced in the formation of policies and legislation in the coming years. Currently, there are 7 UNESCO accredited NGOs from Turkey, and relatively higher number of accredited NGOs does not, of course, guarantee the participation of communities in safeguarding mechanisms, but the awareness is there. So they are among the potential actors for the making of a legislation in the future. Now, Turkey have 21 inscribed elements on UNESCO lists, and we expect 4 new inscriptions to be inscribed in the next committee meeting starting at the end of this month. Turkish Higher Education Council identified 100 priority areas of research in 2018 to provide research grants for PhD students, and intangible heritage is actually one of the priority areas. So that more research is encouraged on topics related to intangible heritage. And also, thanks to the overall results framework developed by the UNESCO Living Heritage Entity, the dialogue in Turkey between governmental institutions has been improved, and the two ministries, that is Ministry of Culture and Ministry of Education, signed a cooperation protocol in 2019 to improve the integration of intangible heritage into formal and non-formal education. As I told before, Turkey do not have an independent legislation on intangible heritage yet, but last 5 years witnessed 2 efforts to explore links between existing legislations and ICH. First, the Ministry of Culture and Tourism created an internal working group to identify connections and understand the relevance of the context to introduce or insert intangible heritage into legislation. Unfortunately, since the final report is not shared with the public, I'm not able to provide any details on their conclusions. Secondly, Turkish National Commission for UNESCO established an ad hoc working group last year to further identify the opportunities and challenges. And the working group came up with a draft law, actually. And the aim was to provide concrete proposals and source of reference to decision makers, especially to Ministry of Culture. I will go into the details of this draft law right before I conclude my presentation. So I would like to provide some brief information on the initial works related to the topic from 1970s and to 1990s. It is interesting to see that the first attempt to place these efforts into a legislation context came from Sedat Veysörnek. He is a prominent folklorist, and he did that in 1976. It was a draft law that proposes to establish the research and collection institution for Turkish folk culture. And the idea was to start a central organization that could collect traditions, literature, games, or crafts, since they face serious threats arising from rapid social, economic, and cultural changes. Next, a book was published in 1990. It is titled, it is of course in Turkish, but I translated into English as Copyright of Folk Culture Products. So the book refers to oral foundations as the basis of statutory law and proposes some suggestions on the rights of informants who provide information for folk culture researchers to enable them to publish books that might have commercial aspects. And the book argues that it is essential to find the balance between culture and rights, and that rights is not only about money, it is equally an important right for informants to be introduced by their names in these books. So the overall approach in Turkey till 1990s seems to echo with the perspective of the UNESCO recommendation on the safeguarding traditional culture and folklore in 1989. Currently, there is very limited research on legislation and ICH, and available publications generally do not refer to Intangible Heritage Convention as a frame of reference. They rather take it in the frame of the protection of folk culture and crafts. And the ones that evaluate the matter in the context of international conventions address a number of issues. For example, extensive use of traditional knowledge without permission creates significant costs for the local people who own this knowledge. On the other hand, unauthorized use of traditional knowledge does not only create economic losses for local people, it can also harm the spiritual and sacred values of these people. For example, such damage can occur when symbols and graphics that are considered sacred to local people are used on decorative products that are sold commercially. In addition, there are ontological inconsistencies or structural technical difficulties in the protection of traditional knowledge in the intellectual property system. In an environment where the modern industrial world's economic dependence on traditional knowledge is high, and where traditional knowledge holders and modern industries using this knowledge have different priorities on a global scale, it is very difficult to establish a powerful protection system in the short term. However, we do know that the need to establish a sui generis protection system for the equitable use and protection of traditional knowledge is obvious. Besides, there are other reasons that show that it is technically difficult to protect traditional knowledge within intellectual property system. For example, intellectual property system in the intellectual property system, traditional knowledge cannot always meet the standards such as innovation or creativity, originality, or identifiable ownership or exclusivity, let's say, which are necessary for a work, invention, or a way of expression to find protection. So this is basically what limited number of publications on the topic in Turkey discuss. As to the current developments with intangible heritage and legislation, Turkey's latest periodic report submitted to UNESCO last year provides some useful information to prove that although implicitly the link between intangible heritage and legislation is already there, but it is scattered around a little bit. Uh, there are a few fields in which it is possible to explore the links. For example, the laws related to food security is where we can identify the connection. The law on veterinary services, phytosanitary food, and animal feed mentions the use of traditional methods in the in the production and processing of food. On the other hand, the law on organic farming refers to the production of organic products using the knowledge accumulated on the use of soil, water, plant, and natural resources. So this is directly about knowledge and practice concerning nature and universe. And the law on Turkish Food Codex that was out in 2011 and revised 2 years ago introduces a microbiological criteria codex for culinary elements such as Turkish coffee, tea, or traditional breads, some of which are inscribed or will be inscribed in the UNESCO representative list. While setting such standards might seem to be in contrast to the living and evolving nature of intangible heritage, I think such legislation is still important to contribute to quality protection, production, and transmission. Now, I will mention two regulations that are related to healthcare and intangible heritage. First one is the regulation on traditional herbal medicinal products. The purpose of the first regulation is to issue licenses for herbal medicinal products prepared from medicinal plants that have protective effects and have traditional uses. And the other aim is to determine the procedures and principles to be followed regarding their safety and quality. The second regulation was issued in 2014. The purpose is to identify such practices and create a frame for trainings and authorization of qualified people. But the role of communities is missing in the legislation. So there is no reference to their involvement or role in this document. So it's a challenge we see in other forms of legislation in Turkey as well. Next is about gender equality. We have strategy plans and policy papers. Of course, they do not explicitly address intangible heritage, but they are still related to the topic. The first one, strategy paper and action plan, mention women's equal access to cultural life and opportunities. And we all know that the Intangible Heritage Convention refers to Universal Human Rights Declaration in its preamble. And access to intangible heritage is a basic human right. So it is important to address women's equal access to cultural life as part of their empowerment. The second one, National Action Plan and Strategy Document for Combating Violence Against Women, is another important paper. As part of the action plan, one of the aims is to identify positive examples in oral literature and folklore that advise social conducts, values, and behaviors that challenge violence against women. The next section of legislation is about knowledge and practices concerning nature and universe. Turkey prepared development plans every 5 years since 1960s, and the latest version of development plan addresses the need to intensify the connection between traditional knowledge and intellectual property. In this sense, the plan recommends to start an inventory study to improve national capacities on traditional knowledge and folklore based on genetic resources. And the regulation on geographical indications and traditional product names is another piece of legislation that is related to intangible heritage. It includes provisions on crafts, traditional food production, and other forms of knowledge and practices in order to maintain certain level of quality of a given product in traditional methods and production. And the last regulation aims to protect local and traditional varieties of field crops or horticultural crops and other plant species and also aim to register the local varieties, increase traditional maintenance ways of the seeds on marketing, and prevent genetic erosion. Uh, some parts of legislation also address issues related to income generation and sustainable livelihoods. The last development plan raises the need to prevent monopolization of production and distribution of cultural products. It also mentions the need to find strategies for ease of branding, marketing, and financing aimed at products that are specific to our culture. Strategic plan of the Ministry of Agriculture takes note of conserving biodiversity, and in this sense, they aim to establish a database for traditional information which is directly related to the aims of the Intangible Heritage Convention, and also life on land, goal 15 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the presidential decision on traditional coastal fisheries aims to register the socioeconomic data of traditional coastal fisheries with the aim of providing a sustainable management for them. And what about the tourism? The law on the encouragement of tourism serves as the basis of current regulations in tourism. We have two regulations that can be linked to intangible heritage. The regulation on the qualifications of tourism facilities, uh, aims to introduce the minimum qualifications of tourism facilities and ensure standards for maintaining and increasing the quality. And Article 17 of this regulation refers to sustainable tourism and emphasizes that there should be balance between protection and the use of biological diversity and cultural and historical resources. So it is one of the crucial aspects of safeguarding. The regulation also pays attention to the promotion and safeguarding of culinary culture. Article 26 tells us that in the menu in a restaurant, it should be ensured five types of food materials are included from local products that are rendered by traditional and modern methods in a mixed way. And the last one with the tourism is the regulation on international health tourism. I see it relevant to our topic because it refers to the use of traditional and complementary medicine practices in health tourism. And I think it might serve as well to contribute to increase the level of respect to and value of traditional knowledge and techniques in society. Uh, Now, I would like to continue with two legislations that were shaped by the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. Firstly, I will address the directive regarding the identification and registration of intangible heritage that was issued in 2020. This directive specifies the procedures and principles regarding the identification and evaluation of cultural heritage bearers and the registration of those in the Information and Documentation Center for Folk Culture. In accordance with the directive on the identification and registration of intangible heritage bearers, the Ministry of Culture identifies craftspeople, local folk music artists, or folk poets. And in line with the first directive I mentioned, an identification card is delivered following their registration in the Information and Documentation Center. So with this card, the tradition bearers have priority in receiving private sectors or government support in terms of finance or involvement in projects, etc. Second legislation from the ministry is the regulation of folk culture archives. The purpose is to define the procedures to be applied to the folkloric materials obtained through research, collection, donation, and purchase to be used in the folk culture archives. Before I conclude my presentation, I have 4 slides left, all of which are about the draft law on the safeguarding of intangible heritage. The draft law is the output of the work carried out by the ad hoc working group established at the National Commission for UNESCO. The group was composed of 3 members who are also the members of the Intangible Heritage Experts Committee at the National Commission. And all 3 members are folklorists. They worked for 1 year examining current policies to come up with a draft law that might serve as a point of reference in the future. And the purpose of this draft is expressed as to safeguard the heritage, obviously, help pass it on to future generations, and to regulate the procedures and principles regarding these issues. One of the remarkable aspects of this draft law is references made to communities. The word community is articulated in the definitions of intangible heritage, inventory, heritage practitioners, and tradition bearers. In addition, the role of communities as stakeholders is emphasized in Article 6 while mentioning cultural spaces and also communities' role in designating these cultural spaces. Uh, Communities are also addressed in the articles that deal with the use of elements, the obligation to mention source of references, illegal uses, sponsorship, or investments. Uh, Drought law has four main parts. I will be going one by one very shortly in each slide. So the first part is titled Intangible Cultural Heritage. There are 15 articles that address issues such as identification, definitions, use of intangible heritage, illegal use, industrial property rights, sponsorship, and other forms of financial contribution. Uh, the next part is about sanctions. With reference to the law of misdemeanor, it proposes to apply administrative fines in the case of misconduct or when deemed necessary. Article 17 is about the application of confiscation in the case that when the products are the result of violation of the law. Uh, Third part is on the establishment of a commission for the safeguarding of intangible heritage and also a boards that will operate on provincial level. Articles from 19 to 25 outline their duties, responsibilities, how they operate, who the members are, or the period of membership, payments, etc. And the final part of the draft is about the execution and ministry responsible for its entry into force. So this draft law was sent to the Ministry of Culture this year in spring to enable them further discuss the text and take actions. We expect to hear back from them for concrete plans and actions. So this is where we are now with the draft law. To conclude, we see different domains of intangible heritage in various legal spheres, but it is mostly there in a scattered fashion. And intangible cultural heritage is rather referred to as traditional knowledge, practices, or methods. So there's no explicit references to the term intangible heritage or the convention in Turkish domestic law, except for the latest strategic plan of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. Although next year marks the 20th anniversary of the convention, it is obvious that lawmakers and legal scholars are not aware of the convention and its importance, so they do not think much about the ways on how to integrate intangible cultural heritage into national laws or why it is important to do so. Uh, Lack of coordination and interest between relevant ministries is also a major challenge, which I should address more. Uh, so, as you might have noticed, there are no connections or references between different law, regulations, and directives, which makes it even harder to come up with a separate policy document that pays regard to different spheres of legislation. Uh, and lastly, another significant development is that intangible heritage is the subject of soft law mechanisms, which means there are no solid sanctions that might prevent people from disrespecting, ignoring, or abusing intangible heritage. This was one of the major topics raised by the members of the ad hoc working group while they were addressing the effectiveness of future legislation on intangible heritage. So their argument is that intangible heritage legislation without intimidating sanctions or fines would not work well. Thank you. This is the end of my presentation.